In Genesis 12, verse 1, the Lord had said to Abraham, "Get out of your country, from your relatives, from your father's house, to a land that I will show you." This starts a movement of Abram that becomes very significant. Abram name becomes Abraham, as we know, as we go through the history of Genesis. And the last part of chapter 11 kind of focused in on the development of the line that resulted in Abram. And his father lived in Ur of the Chaldees, ancient Chaldea, very advanced civilization for the time. And he moved his family up to Haran, probably nearby Carchemish, kind of at the origin between the Tigris and Euphrates River. That area was an area of ancient civilization, Sumerian civilization, and it was largely populated by children of Shem, Semitics, and God calls Abram to leave that country in which he was so comfortable. Now have him cross over the big valley from Babylon or Chaldea all the way across up to near Carchemish, where they called Haran, then called down to go down to the land of Canaan. He also developed the name Abraham the Hebrew. You find that when this account of Sodom and Gomorrah, there's someone who comes to tell Abraham the Hebrew about the fact that his nephew Lot had been taken captive. So you have this name Abraham the Hebrew mentioned in Genesis, and we also find out from usage that the children of Abraham became known as Hebrews. Matter of fact, we find that in the account of Joseph. He's talked about the Hebrew servant and talking about the Hebrews who did not eat with the Egyptians. This term Hebrew originated with Abraham. It has its root in meaning crossing over. So it means this guy who crossed over from a far country into our country. Kind of like he was a stranger. Maybe he didn't belong here, and that's part of the reason for the name Hebrew. Now for the other names of what we know as the biblical nation or children of God, Israel, and then the Jews, they came from other descendants. Abraham had Isaac. Isaac had Jacob. Jacob had 12 sons, and from them came the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob was renamed Israel by God when he had an experience of wrestling with God and finding out that he needed to submit to God's plan. But be that as it may, the name Israel came from Jacob, the grandson of Abraham. Then one of Israel, or Jacob's 12 sons, was Judah, and he became the progenitor of King David, and David's kingdom was known as the kingdom of Israel, but it was combined of 12 tribes. And after Solomon, 10 of the tribes split and went with another king, not of David's line. And the ones who stayed with David's line was the kingdom of Judah, and they became known as Jews, particularly during the time of that captivity. Actually, the end of the time of the nation of Judah before it went into captivity, they were already being referred to as Jews, as having come from Judah. And particularly after the Babylonian captivity, you had the return of the Jews to their land. Now, as we go through, whether it's Abraham, the Hebrew, the one who crossed over, whether it's Israel, who we know had a time of 400 years captivity in Egypt before the children of Israel came back into the land, and whether you have the Jews who spent 70 years in captivity in Babylon before they came back, we're often given the impression when it comes to the children of God, they don't really seem to be at home in this world the way you would expect them to be. And I find a very interesting parallel in Hebrews chapter 11. it talks about some heroes of the faith. And we see in Hebrews chapter 11, after explaining about what faith is, Hebrews 11 gives some examples of people who were people of faith. The first one mentioned is Abel, who offered a better sacrifice. How? By faith than Cain, his belief that he needed to stand before God with the protection of the blood of the Lamb. And then you had Enoch, who was a preacher before the flood, who was kind of letting people know, don't get too comfortable in this world, there's judgment coming. In fact, Enoch's son was Methuselah. And Methuselah means when he dies, it will come. And Enoch was a preacher of judgment. And he named his son, when he dies, it will come. And if you add up the years of the people up to the time of Noah, you'll find that Methuselah died the year of the flood. And actually, Noah was the grandson of Methuselah. And Methuselah, as his father Enoch prophesied, died when the flood came. So you have Abel, you have Enoch, then you have Noah, who by faith built the ark and gave us a great example of being lifted above the waters of judgment, being safe in the ark. And then we have next Abraham. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 8, it says, by faith Abraham, being called, obeyed to go out to a place which he was about to receive for an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. Well, I think some of us can sympathize with that, going out without knowing where we're going, but this was responding to the call of God. Very interesting thing it mentions about the faith of Abraham in this very early response to God's call. It says that he was, verse 10, he was looking for a city that had foundations, whose builder and maker was God. It's in verse 9, is by faith he sojourned in a land of promise as a stranger in tents and dwellings with Isaac and Jacob, the co-heirs of his promise. It says they were looking for a better city. They didn't care that they didn't have a permanent home here. When you go to verse 13, it says, by faith these all died, not having received the promise, but saw them afar off and welcomed and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims upon the earth. For the ones who are saying these things, this is verse 14 of Hebrews 11, they are making it plain that they are seeking a homeland. And if they liked the one they came out of, they could have gone back. Now they are setting their sights on a better land. This is a heavenly one. That's why God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he's prepared for them a city. Interesting how one of the aspects of faith, of saving faith, is the awareness that we are pilgrims on this earth. There's an old song, this world is not my home, we're just a passing through. And this is true. We are looking, as it says here, for a city that is truly permanent. Any city on this earth that we know will certainly pass away. In fact, we know that this whole world will pass away. But there will be a new city that arrives in the new heavens and new earth, a permanent, truly permanent dwelling place for people of faith. So as we talk about Abram being the first Hebrew, someone who left his home to go somewhere else, trusting that God would eventually give him a permanent dwelling. And with Israel going into captivity, Judah going into captivity, we're constantly reminded this world is not our home. When you live by faith, you live knowing that there's something better ahead. Jesus said, I go to prepare a place for you. This is faith, believing there's something better, believing there's something beyond what we see, and believing that God has called us to a heavenly home, to an eternal home. And when we come to faith in Jesus Christ, we are confessing that there's more than what we see. Our hope is based because there's something better coming. And as Jesus promised, we believe him that he will come again and receive us to himself, that where he is, we can be also. Those are my thoughts for today. Thanks for listening.